She described as being tall, dark, and smart, which is a wonderful, wonderful description. She is also described as being affectionate, forgiving, and generous, but not all the time. She belonged to a family in New Jersey where her family, there were members of her family owned slaves. We think that the slaves were all in the South, but that's not true. She had very firm ideas. She stated that slaves were people like everyone else, that the South didn't have the qualities necessary to win the war. They didn't have the material resources. She said that maybe women weren't the inferior sex, and perhaps it was a mistake to deny women suffrage. And interestingly enough, that everyone was a half-breed of some sort. Now, I'm half English and half Irish. I guess I qualify. She wasn't afraid to say after the Civil War was over that the right side won, which isn't what you would expect of her. She was living in New York at the time. She had a domineering husband, and the rule when they got married was that he was going to dominate, and they had some rousing battles, most of which she lost, one way or another. One time, she didn't speak to him for 3 years. He made a will, and he left his property to his brother. And it's a complicated real estate transaction, because the brother had owned it, and Varina could not stand this brother. She could not stand Joseph. They were at war the whole time that they were married. But he had given him the farm, but not the papers that went with it, is what it amounted to. And he was afraid that the Howells would get Briarfield their plantation. He was 18 years older than she was. It's highly unlikely that this would happen. She was born in New Jersey. She grew up in the South. She went to school in both the North and the South, and she went to a very exclusive school in Philadelphia. Like Mary Lincoln, she had relatives on both sides of the Civil War. It doesn't seem to have been terribly important to her, as it really wasn't to Mary either. She started out in a very wealthy family, but her father went when she was very young, and the family had to cut back drastically. Jefferson Davis was a richer than most man, but of course he lost everything he put in. He changed his money into Confederate money, and he lost it all. You know, it's the old saying, save your Confederate money, boys, the South shall rise again. But she fell madly in love with him, and she never got over it. Now, as I describe some of his activities, you're going to see what he was like. Later in his life, he described her as the chain he had to drag around. How would you like to be told that? She was not his first wife. His first wife was the daughter of Zachary Taylor, who later became president. But he was a military. This girl was always called Knox. And Zachary Taylor was military, and of course they were transferred all around the country. And they were in the South, and Mrs. Taylor insisted that he get an assignment in the North because she did not want her children to be exposed to yellow fever and malaria. So Zach did as he was told. But they were sufficiently opposed to her marrying Jefferson Davis that her parents did not go to the wedding. They really were not approving. Her father didn't want her to because he didn't want her to live the military life. And if, you know, all of us know somebody in Fort Drum and how many places they've been. We understand that. Immediately after Jefferson Davis and Varina were married, they went on their honeymoon, and they went to the South to visit his brother. Part of the purpose of new bride to visit his first wife's grave. Now, this was a Southern custom. Can you imagine what they putting up with that? But anyway, that's what happened. But the sad fact is that she indeed did get malaria. They both did, exactly what her mother had feared. And she died in his arms when they'd only been married 3 months. Well, I'm sorry? The first wife, Sarah Knox Taylor. He didn't get married for a while after, but she went to visit some relatives in Mississippi, and this brother Joseph, whom she ended up hating, sent Jefferson over to where she was staying to invite her to visit the Davis home, and she agreed. And that was how she met him. He came to invite her to his brother's home. He was a lot like Washington in one respect only, because he was noted for his poor judgment. He looked like a president. That's how Washington got to be president, because he looked like a president, and he did. But he is described as being, some books say, over 6 feet tall. He had gray eyes, high cheekbones, thick curly hair, and a melodic speaking voice, which is a wonderful description. On top of that, it turns out he was the worst hypochondriac in the world. Every time he had to make a decision, he got sick. She ended up taking care of him. He was kind of a typical plantation owner. He was very, very good rider, a hunter, and a marksman. Among his negatives was that everybody had to agree with him, or he threw a tantrum. He had a terrible temper combined with an iron will. You can't think of a much worse combination. And as I said, she was captivated by him for the rest of his life. He once kept her living with the children in England for 3 years, while he came back to first to Baltimore and then to Memphis and lived with various women. When he was a very, very good Democratic speaker, and he went all over the country speaking, and she did not like this. And he wrote letters about how he, quote, called on various female acquaintances while he was on the road. Tells you all you need to know, doesn't it? Her tenure as First Lady is essentially described as being a disaster, primarily because she couldn't keep her mouth shut. He wanted her to act as a good example, and she absolutely couldn't do that. It's interesting in this age, when we're hearing that the post office may close down, that into the Civil War, the post office was operating in the South after the Civil War had begun. Not the entire time, but at the beginning. So she had spent 12 years in Washington, and she corresponded with her friends who were in Washington. I'm sure you know that across from the White House is a building called, or 2 buildings actually, called Blair House, where when people come to visit, they shut them across the street and let them live over there. It was the Blairs and the Lees who she was communicating with. She also communicated with Buchanan after he was out of, when he was in the White House and after. This didn't mean anything to her. She didn't care what the politics were. She was a very astute politician, but she didn't get hung up on it. She and Mary Lincoln were in Washington at the same time, but there's no record that they ever met. Their only point of contact was a dressmaker, Elizabeth Keckley. Elizabeth Keckley wrote a book mainly about Mary Lincoln. And if those of you who listened to my presentation on Mary Lincoln, Mary and her spending was one of Elizabeth's main topics. She was described ambiguously as being a wavering Confederate patriot. Don't you love that? They got married on February 16, 1845, at her parents' home by an Episcopal minister. There's no record of there having been church actively, but they did. One of the slaves who ran away and wrote a book described her as she certainly talked a lot. When they got married, he was 37 and she was 19. And I don't know if I have it in my notes or not. For a great deal of their marriage, she called him Uncle Jack, which certainly gives you some insight into the relationship, doesn't it? One of the things she had to do was manage, here's this young girl, 19, she had to manage 47 slaves. Can you, they had to do everything for them. They had to make sure they were clothed, they were fed, their medical needs were met, they were told what to do. That's a huge job. Martha Washington, for example, knew how. She was taught how. Varina Davis did not. She did not know how. It's one thing for a woman like Martha Washington, when she married George, to do it. It's something else. You have to admire her. She grew up, the family had no money, and those Howells were a weird family. They really were. Her brothers never could hold a job. They had trouble with the law. They roamed around. They were always coming to her, and she managed the family. Her father wasn't to do that well, of course. And of course she had in-law problems. When you take into account that she was a generation younger than her sisters-in-law, at one point, that Joseph was something else. They had a widowed sister, and the plantation they were on, Joseph moved this sister and 7 children into the house with Jefferson Davis and Varina against their will. How would you like to have 9 people move into your house, even a plantation mansion? And Varina didn't like it. There was nothing she could do about it. And as a matter of fact, Jefferson couldn't either. That it was just one of those things that Joseph Davis was an autocrat in every sense of the word. Jefferson Davis went to Congress, and it's interesting that they moved to what was called the primitive Washington, D.C., which is an interesting description, isn't it, for the mid-1800s. When the Mexican War came along, Jefferson Davis went to that war. So this meant that Rita had to go back to the plantation, and she really wasn't all that thrilled with it. She was an urban person, and she liked Washington. She wanted to have children, but it was 7 years before she had a successful pregnancy, even as young as she was. And again, the books make mention of the fact during all this time he was visiting the aphorism being female acquaintances. When they were in Washington, Zachary Taylor was president, which put them in the upper echelon of Washington society. And one of the things about Varina was she loved clothes. She just loved rich fabrics, fashionable clothes. Every fad she fell for it. She liked it. She liked to wear hoopsters. I think we talked about this with Mary Lincoln. There's some of us here that wore crinolines, these many years ago, but we wore them. And I had one that had a hoop. I'm not sure, I was heavy at that time. I can't imagine what I looked like. The plantation was pretty productive. Let me see what year, in the 1850s, the plantation produced 350 to 400 bales of cotton a year, which put them up in the top 6% of the plantation owners. That was worth $40,000. Now in that era, $40,000 was a huge fortune. If somebody's better at math than I am could figure out what would be in today's economy. And this afforded them all kinds of luxuries for them. But don't forget, all of this, having somebody do everything, do the breakfast dishes, clean the bathroom, all of that was done by somebody else. She could sleep late, she could entertain, She could stay up until 2 a.m. and read. She could do anything she wanted. She didn't have to get up and get kids to school. She didn't have to do any of those things. You have to remember that. And what those slaves, I found out things about slaves that I hadn't read, I hadn't noticed before. They had the slaves picking cotton by moonlight. They had slave children eating breakfast out of a trough. You know what a trough is? It's like pigs eat. This is the kind of treatment they got, and apparently it was routine. All of the founding fathers have had a problem with the fact everybody's equal, and here they are. Their wealth and luxuries depended on slavery. You look back at them, you could certainly describe them as hypocrites, couldn't you? They really were. In 1854, one of her sons died of measles. It's coming back. The children died just last week. It was in the paper. Children died of measles. But she had a little girl in 1855 who was Margaret. Jefferson Davis was often ill. He was partially blind. He was domineering. But as I said, they were in the higher echelons of Washington society. And she could go to every party. And she's described, here's one of her gowns that women will understand. She wore a black lace Bertha. And a Bertha was a thing that came over the head, and it was V-shaped down to here, and came back over the other shoulder. It was very elaborate. And the skirt was gold silk, and the skirt was covered with black velvet bows and small lemon-colored silk bows. At this point, she was described as being cultivated, which is a very ambiguous term. Washington was a hotbed of intrigues of various types. Their women were having affairs with other men, and there was an incident in which a lawyer was killed by a congressman because one of them had taken up with the other's wife. I don't think in Washington today it's come to that, but it comes close. The secession was a very serious thing insofar as marriage was concerned, because a lot of couples actually separated over it because it was such a cantankerous subject. The Davises didn't. Mississippi left the Union in 1861, so Jefferson Davis resigned from the Senate, and they left town. Back, she had to go to that plantation that she didn't want to be in. And their journey back to Mississippi was described as being very unpleasant, and it's described in the book in detail, and it was not pleasant. He became the provisional president of the Confederacy in February of 1861. And at this point, the capital was Montgomery, Alabama. But that was only temporary. By this time, as I said, she was the first lady of the Confederacy, and she was communicating with President Buchanan. You know what he did when he had to make a decision? Sat down and cried. The Confederate government moved to Richmond in May of 1961, and the Davises were very, very popular. They moved into a home at Clay and 12th Street, the corner of Clay and 12th Street, into a big gray house, which was promptly christened the White House. Now, there's a fine irony there, isn't there? She was 5'6", and most women were 5 feet to 5'2". It gave her a commanding appearance. Any room she stood out. And she always dressed fabulously. And she received her hairstyle. It was called a shigna. Sometimes they braid the hair and then roll it into a bun and break the back of the head. That's how she wore her hair. In 1857, she had another boy, and this was Jefferson Davis Jr. She contracted puerperal fever, which killed a lot of women. before the advent of antibiotics. Childbirth was a very, very risky business. On the day that, well, he had become senator for all of Buchanan's time in the White House. And they, of course, he had a very special, a very busy social life. She had the puerperal fever, but she survived. She had another son in 1859, and of course she was afraid that she would have puerperal fever, but she didn't. This was Joseph Evan. Now she had to name this son for this despised brother-in-law, but she did it. Probably Jeff said, do what she did, like she did everything else. She had what is described charitably as an olive complexion, and people who didn't like her called her a mulatto. And that term isn't in use, you know what I mean? Yeah. Okay. She had a wicked sense of humor, and she mimicked people. She had that in common with Jackie Kennedy. Jackie Kennedy was wicked at mimicking people. She was described as being brilliant but unrefined, which you can just determine however you wish. She was not devoted to the cause, and she was very, very criticized for it, made papers that she thought the Confederacy couldn't win. She, her husband was inaugurated in 1861. She went to the inaugural. Halfway through it, she called for a carriage and left. They asked her why, and she said, "Oh, he seemed like a willing victim going to his funeral pyre." And she was right. But can you? I have studied every one of those first ladies, and nobody ever walked out of that time. They ultimately had 6 children, and I'll jump ahead a little bit and tell you that when she died, she only had 1. That first little girl was the only survivor. The book goes into some detail about how she was criticized. The more things change, the more they stay the same, don't they? Their hairstyles, their choice in clothes, their choice in china, their choice in friends, anything is their fair game for the newspapers. In 1864, their son, Jeff, fell off a balcony at the house in Richmond and died 45 minutes later. Having studied the royal family too, Queen Victoria had a grandson to which the same thing happened. In 1864, she had a daughter called Varina, who was always called Witty, who would be her pride and joy for the rest of her life. By 1864, things were not good in Richmond. They really were not. Varina's mother lived with her, and she was an autocrat too. They went to church, and Mrs. Howell put Mrs. Lee out of her church pew, for which she had to apologize. I forgot to tell you that Davis's salary as Confederate president was $25,000. In 1864, she saw a little black boy being beaten downtown Richmond, so she took him home with her. And he was a part of the family from then on. In 1864, she left Richmond for Charleston. And she took $2,000 in gold, a revolver, and some books, and this little kid. When they got to Charleston, they had no place to stay, and a Confederate general found her a place to live in Charleston with another company, or with another family, rather. Their home in Richmond was looted, and General Ord's wife stole all of her clothes. When Lincoln was assassinated, it was thought that Davis was involved, and there was a price on his head. So he was traveling, and he met up with her in Georgia. Now, at one time, and on this train with her was the Confederate Treasury.
which was interesting.
On May 10th,
1865, they were discovered by Union troops, and Davis was taken prisoner.
there's always been a story that he was wearing women's clothes, and it's not true. She put a raincoat over him, around him, and threw a shawl over his head.
He was not in women's clothes.
He knew he was being watched by soldiers, so he slept in his riding clothes. She ran up to him and threw her arms around him, and a soldier had him in his sights. But when Varina embraced him, he
Dropped his gun.
He was taken to Monroe, Virginia, to Fort Monroe, Virginia, to a prison, and they wouldn't let her go with him. She visited him, she tried, but she couldn't,
They wouldn't let her.
when she got to Savannah, she went to Florida too. When she got to Savannah, she gave this little boy, this little black boy, to a Union general, just handed him over. Her mother and her 3 oldest children, now she kept Winnie with her, but the other 3 she took to, they went to Montreal.
And she continued in the U.S.
And she began to run out of money,
But the supporters were giving her some.
and as I said, there's always been stories that somehow or other, she and Jeff
Davis stole the Confederate treasury.
which isn't true. But there's another interesting story that it cropped up just recently, within the last few months, I think, that Confederate gold is buried somewhere between Richmond and Charleston and Savannah. And it has been hunted for extensively, but nobody's ever found it. So if you want to go on a treasure hunt, maybe that's what you should do. Varina and her children and her mother were in Montreal with her family, the Howells. And those Howells, they were in constant trouble all the time, and including a sister who had a baby out of wedlock, which was a huge problem. Finally, Davis was released from prison in May of 1867 after a lot of people put pressure to bear, and he rejoined the family, the 2 of them, in Montreal. And they decided they would go to England. Well, of course, they didn't have any money. And when, in 1869, Andrew Johnson issued an amnesty, which isn't a pardon, but it's an amnesty to all of the Confederates, and Davis was free. So they could go to England. Davis got a job in a commission house. I don't know what people in commission houses do, sell something, I suppose, and earn money that way. And at that point, they seemed to have plenty of money. But in 1869, he took a job with an insurance company in Baltimore. And he sailed away and left the children and Varina in England. And she was in the upper echelons of society there. Remember Queen Mary of England? She went and spent a day with Queen Mary's mother. He later became president of that company, that insurance company, and he moved to Memphis. What he didn't want to do was live with his wife and children. And at this point, he took up with Virginia Clay. Now, Clement Clay, her husband, had been in the prison in Fort Monroe with Davis, and he became enamored with her. He wrote her amazingly intimate letters, some of which are included in this book. He'd go months without writing to Varina in England, but he wrote to her. And he told Varina that she wasn't coming to Memphis. She was staying in England, and of course she was short of money. But people kept giving it to her, apparently. He was writing these love letters to Virginia Clay all this time. Her husband apparently did not know about this. And we don't know whether Varina did or not.
Probably not, but she may have.
And there was scandal about Davis that made the newspapers. He was on a train, and he had a sleeping berth. There were rules about sleeping berths on trains, that nobody was supposed to be with you. And the people in the rest of the car detected unusual activity. And they called the conductor. It is thought that it was Virginia Clay, and she got off at the next stop. But this was in a lot of the newspapers.
And I forgot to mention that at one point,
It was, the newspapers printed a list of Jefferson Davis illegitimate children. Nothing, and it doesn't say how many there were, but they existed. He continued to communicate with many women, but he concentrated on Virginia. Their son, Billy, died of diphtheria in 1872, age 10. I'm struck every time I read about what happened to these families and their children that seems so unbelievably unnecessary for us. He lost his job with the insurance company in 1873, and Varina began taking in sewing in order to earn some money. In 1875, he was still chasing Virginia Clay and writing her these intimate letters. At this point, Varina began to have both physical and emotional and mental illness, including what's called, quote, a nervous breakdown, which has a lot of different definitions. And she continued to struggle with money issues. He wasn't giving her any money. And things were getting pretty desperate. Well, at this point, enter Sarah Dorsey, another woman who is described as being a rich widow but not pretty. And she was a writer. And she had a plantation and she had money, you name it, she had it, except beauty. So he moved in with her ostensibly to help him write his memoirs. Just another example of his incredibly bad judgment,
which he always had.
And on top of that, he wanted Varina to move in with him.
Well, Varina drew the line. She wouldn't do it.
She came back in 1877. And she went to Memphis at that point. She did not go to the Mississippi coast. Can you imagine the gossip that this engendered? Even without television and the internet, it's still there. And his affair, literally, with Virginia continued. But something great happened to him at this point. Sarah Dorsey, with all her money, made a new will and left everything to him. So finally, Varina did go to live in the plantation. And they're described as living in an uneasy peace. which probably is an understatement. And in 1878, there was another yellow fever epidemic. And their son Jeff, who at this point was an adult, died of that. But they lived in the same house, but they did their grieving separately. Now that's sad, when they have lost so many children. Sarah Dorsey died of breast cancer in 1879. As I said, leaving most of her belongings to Jefferson Davis. And there was an uproar among her relatives who expected to get a lot of this money, or all of it. He didn't get it. But they had to fight off these relatives to keep the plantation and the money and everything else. Varina, for all of her spunk or whatever you want to call it, did everything for him. She made her living at the end of her life of writing, and she helped him write his memoirs. She corrected them, she got in touch with
People, she did all of these things.
And he was so ungrateful. In his memoirs, he actually blamed her for the fact that he
was captured.
At this point, they went to England, they went to Paris, and their daughter Varina had stayed there when her mother came back to the U.S. And she went to school there, she traveled around Europe, and she was quite a sophisticated young woman. She became her mother's constant companion and confidant. One of the former Confederacy officers dubbed her daughter of the Confederacy, and it stuck to her for the rest of her life. She frequently visited relatives all
Around the South and the North.
and she was famous in her own right. In 1886, she traveled to Syracuse to visit relatives. And she became a very close friend of the Pulitzer family. You know, the Pulitzer Prize family, the newspaper family. After 5 years, Davis had finally given up on Virginia Clay because her husband died, and she became engaged to another man. In 1887. And the book says it struck him like a thunderbolt. Oh, didn't he have it coming? Their daughter came back with them from Paris and joined them at Beauvoir. That was the name of the plantation in Mississippi. When he came to Syracuse, she met what is variously described as a friend or a distant relative in Syracuse, and his name was Alfred Wilkinson Jr. His father was a lawyer who was described as having been a founder of Syracuse. Now, I can't find anything to corroborate this, and I wrote an email to the Historical Association in Onondaga County, but I got no response. Because it's interesting. Because when they were about to get married, they found that Al Jr.'s father and his brother had been speculating with the bank's money, and the bank was broke. This was a huge, huge blow to Syracuse. It was a huge blow to their marriage plans. Alfred apparently was a catch. At that point, he was rich. He was handsome, 6 feet tall, well-mannered, companionable, and extremely well-educated, and they were in love. Jefferson Davis wouldn't consent to the marriage. He was a Northerner. His father had been an abolitionist. He had nothing, so far as Jefferson Davis was concerned, to make it acceptable for the daughter of the Confederacy to marry him. But all of a sudden, he changed his mind and said, let it go. So they set the wedding date. But what happened was that Jefferson Davis died in 1889. And if you know anything about that era, you know that mourning was a very big deal. And so they couldn't get married at the time that they had planned. And then, he died in bronchitis in New Orleans at the age of 81. They were supposed to get married in 1890, but there was huge furor over it when it got out among the public in the South. But everybody in Syracuse thought it was great. No, but they definitely did not. In October of 1890, the engagement was broken because Varina did not think that he made enough money. He made between $5,000 and $6,000, which was a very good salary in that era. The real reason, it is thought, was because she did not want to give up Winnie and not have her as a companion. Even the family home, which was, you know what James Street, Syracuse is? It's all those big houses that are kind of gone to seed, but anyway, they owned one of them. And someone who was a friend of the family bid it in so that Alfred could continue to live there. They broke the engagement, but they never gave each other up, and neither of them ever married. He lived there, they communicated, but
The marriage never took place.
At about this time, they went to live in New York, and as a representative of her parents, Winnie gave speeches all over the U.S. She was famous. She wrote books. She was a very, very prominent person. She went to Atlanta, where she contracted what is described as malarial gastritis. Well, I know what malaria is, and I know what gastritis is, but I never heard of them being together. Gastritis is the stomach. And it was serious, so she died of it. Varina was living in a hotel in New York, and she was writing. She made between $5,000 and $6,000 a year, like her respected son-in-law, and she did very, very well. I was just discussing with Sue the fact that Varina Davis came to Canton.